Odin, the vicious lord of the battle-slain, the father of victory, an insatiable seeker of hidden knowledge at any price, the god of the poets and a phenomenal poet himself. It is Odin who prepares an army of the best warriors in Valhalla for the looming apocalyptic battle of Ragnarök, when the world will be coated by crimson gore and when the beams of the sun will turn black. Odin is thus fury. He is ecstasy and he is knowledge. The Nordic Allfather is a famous and venerable mythological character of the Viking Age. As we just said, he is best known for being a god of war and a god of knowledge. Famously, Odin prepares for Ragnarök by assembling a great army. Just as famously, he gives his eye and pays many a price for the acquisition of hidden knowledge. He is the one-eyed god, who appears in a variety of shape-shifting forms in order to achieve his countless goals. This characterization of the Viking god is very popular, but it is not adequately extensive. As indicated by more than 100 different titles and nicknames that Odin has, he is the most prolific and complicated god of the Nordic mythological corpus. He is at once an old man with a grey beard and the white-brimmed hat of a wizard, and at the same time he is a ferocious man of strength. He is the god of the dead, and yet he himself also dies. We can go on describing him like this forever. The study of Norse mythology eventually always leads back to Odin. But perhaps the most interesting and equally most important aspect of Odin is to be found in a single episode, that of his self-sacrifice. Odin hung himself on a windy tree for 9 long nights, sacrificing himself to himself. And after this immense self-torture, he gains profound knowledge. This knowledge is in the form of magical runes as well as 18 powerful spells. From this point onwards, as a result of this horrible, self-imposed agony, Odin becomes Odin. He becomes the powerful, ambitious, and complicated god that we now know him to be. Odin hanging himself is a transformation and ultimately a rebirth in a new role, hence the titles, Odin the Hanging and Lord of the Hanged. Today we will deal with one single question. Why did Odin hang himself? What is the meaning of this self-sacrifice on behalf of a god? Why did he sacrifice himself to himself? What was the process of this self-sacrifice? What did it lead to, and ultimately what does it mean? For the purpose of this inquiry, we will consult the original material that details the hanging of Odin. We will then build on it in several different directions by looking at the meaning of his act, the meaning of the ritual behavior around it, as well as the symbolism inherent to these kinds of mythological stories. We will also consider the difference between sacrifice, martyrdom, and initiation. Was the hanging of Odin a purposeful trial for the acquisition of something specific, or was it a symbolic initiation into one of his many secretive cults? This is the hanging god. As we said in our introduction, Odin is the most prevalent character of Norse mythology. To understand Odin is to understand the mythology as a whole, but we immediately face an obstacle here. A proper understanding of Odin is locked behind a very elusive story, the story of his sacrifice. Odin hanging himself as an offering to himself infinitely complicates our ability to obtain a full grasp of this god, and yet we have to try. There is no better way to undertake this than to engage with the primary material right off the bat. Hence, we must consult the Hávamál, the words of the High One. This is a poem in the Old Norse, within which we find the small but significant episode of Odin hanging himself. In 2 short stanzas, Odin speaks to us directly. He, the tormented and reborn god, and we, the acolytes of his cult. I read for you now stanzas 139 and 140 of the Hávamál. I know that I hung on that windy tree for 9 long nights, marked by a spear, given to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree of which no man knows from where its roots run. No bread did they give me, nor drink from a horn. Downwards I looked, I picked up the runes. Screaming I took them, then I fell down from there. These are the only 2 stanzas in the entire Nordic mythology that speak of Odin's hanging. Immediately we can point out the evident narrative sequence. Odin hangs himself on a windy tree for 9 nights. He is marked by a spear, i.e. he has a spear wound. Odin is given to Odin, myself to myself, on a tree which nobody knows where the roots run. We will return to this tree in a short while, but for now it is important to point out that giving something or somebody to a god is exactly the same as sacrificing it. This is the language that the Vikings used for sacrificial rituals. I sacrifice this animal to Odin and I give this animal to Odin means exactly the same thing. Thus, we are witnessing a ritual sacrifice here. This is certain. Odin hangs for 9 long nights, during which he suffers from hunger and thirst. The ending of this excruciating period is marked by Odin looking down, whereupon he finds the magical runes. He screams in agony as he takes them, and then he is finally released from the noose. All of these small details, from the tree with its mysterious roots, to the spear, the duration of the hanging, looking downwards specifically to pick up the runes, this is all of severe importance and we will address everything in due time. For now, however, let us briefly summarize. For a reason currently unknown to us, the great god Odin has to torture himself in return for the gift of runes. The Hávamál goes on to list 17 of the 18 powerful spells that Odin learns as a result of acquiring these runes. Among these spells, we have one that allows him to resurrect the dead and speak to them, for example. This is very powerful knowledge. This knowledge grants him boundless magical ability, and it is without a doubt that Odin increased this magical ability even more by the time of the apocalyptic Ragnarök. From this narrative sequence, we immediately see all of the hallmarks of a typical sacrifice. The Roman phrase do ut des represents the ritual perfectly. I give so that you might give. Odin gives himself in order to receive the runes in return. The act of sacrifice is easily summarized by this formula. The sacrificer gives something of value so that the recipient also gives something up in return, hopefully and willingly. This being an act of willingness on behalf of the recipient is an important distinction that we will return to. We can thus turn the sacrifice into a recipe with 4 parts: the sacrificer, the offering, the recipient, and the offering in return. It is here, however, that our very first problem arises already. Odin clearly breaks the traditional formula of sacrifice. When Odin hangs himself, he is the main ingredient in 3 of the 4 parts. By hanging himself on a tree in exchange for the runes, Odin is at the same time the sacrificer, the offering, and the recipient. This is what he says: given to Odin, myself to myself. This raises the immediate question of why. If Odin is the sacrificer and the recipient, why would the offering in return not already be in his possession? If the recipient is supposed to give him the runes, how does any of this make sense if Odin himself is the recipient? Why would he need to go through this entire ordeal? And who could possibly be the one that bestows these runes on him if Odin is at the same time the sacrificer and the recipient? As we will see today, there are many possible answers to this question. For now, though, let us say that what we are dealing with clearly cannot be labeled as only a sacrifice, since Odin breaks the traditional mold in how he performs this sacrificial ritual. As is the case very often with mythological and religious tales, several interpretations can coexist at the same time. Odin sacrificed himself to himself, but it is not only a sacrifice that he performed. But let us leave this aside for the time being and return to the ritual hanging itself, specifically its multiple parts. As we just saw, we have an array of information: the windy tree, the spear wound, the 9 nights, and of course the act of hanging itself. Perhaps we can begin our detailing of the ritual with this act of hanging. What could have driven Odin to do this? What goal does Odin consistently seek throughout the entirety of the mythological corpus that could explain his underlying motivations? Hanging yourself is a very great and agonizing ordeal, so there must be a good reason behind the act. Everyone knows very well that Odin hungers after knowledge. His hunger for knowledge is in fact so high that he is willing to physically mutilate himself to acquire it. He famously pledges one of his eyes in return for wisdom. He digs it out of his own eye socket and puts it into the well of Mimir. Mimir, who is most likely a giant, demands that Odin give a valuable pledge. If he does this, he will be granted permission to drink from the well of wisdom that Mimir guards. Odin has no apprehensions here whatsoever. He mutilates himself and thus gains knowledge. What sort of knowledge he gains exactly by doing this is undetermined, but it is inherently of a divine form, for it is granted to him by a mythological, primordial being, and not a regular, mythologized human. This being of primordial ancestry, Mimir, is eventually decapitated. Odin treats his head with a herbal solution, preserves it, and keeps it alive. Thus, Mimir's head now whispers its primordial secrets into Odin's ear all year round. We will return to this as well. Likewise, at some point after his hanging, on more than one occasion, Odin is seen seeking out the dead, gathering their knowledge as well. Specifically, he seeks out the dead female seers, the Volvur. Their knowledge is some of the most valuable in the entire world. They are experts of pre-Christian European shamanism. We will return to the specifics of this knowledge in a little bit, but it is worth pointing out that this sort of magic was unbecoming for men. It was mostly the female who engaged in this sort of magical activity. This only accentuates just how much Odin was hungry for knowledge. He was willing to participate in that which was unbecoming for a god of war and victory. Odin crossed from the masculine domain into the feminine, despite the stigma that would often be associated with such an act, such a taboo for a strong masculine character. Evidently, Odin's search for knowledge was far more important than these kinds of social considerations, and he was willing to seek knowledge in a great multitude of places. For this search of knowledge, Odin also takes advantage of two ravens, Hugin and Munin. These birds fly and gather information across the entire world every day, and they then report their findings to Odin. Odin, of course, stores this information very carefully. As we see in the Gylfaginning, Odin has no issue recalling the vast knowledge that he has collected. In 3 different disguises, he reveals his encyclopedic knowledge of the mythical cosmology to King Gylfi. The creation of the world and its looming destruction are intimately familiar to Odin. Most importantly, Odin knows very well that he will die at the final battle. All of his efforts to prevent this are futile, and yet he still prepares a grand army for that glorious, fatal day. These are just a few examples of the many cases where Odin is seen desperately collecting knowledge. He also proves that he has mastery over this knowledge. He is able to share it as if it is something that he has personally witnessed. This, of course, begs a very natural question. Why does he seek this knowledge so intensely? For now, we can be satisfied by giving the simplest and most obvious answer. Odin prepares for Ragnarök. After all, this is directly tied to a major part of his other activity, the collection of warriors in Valhalla. Odin builds himself an army in preparation for the mythological apocalypse. Throughout his long mythological life, Odin came to learn that Ragnarök is fated to happen. There is nothing he can do. But as the leader of the pantheon and the leader of men, he is bound by a certain sense of duty to still try and do something. Perhaps he can exceed his allotted portion of fate. And so an army must be raised. Those men who die in battle most gloriously are retrieved from the battlefield by Odin's Valkyries. They then transport them to Odin's Great Hall, the Hall of the Slaughtered, where the warriors feast every night and fight every day, preparing themselves for the final apocalyptic showdown. Thus, we can safely assume that this is precisely why Odin yearns for knowledge so intensely. The coming of Ragnarök was revealed to him by a dead Volva, but one can never know too much about an upcoming existential battle. Odin must continue preparing his body and preparing his mind for the most important event of the entire cosmological chronology. Before we return to the significance of being hanged in the context of acquiring knowledge, and having now outlined how and why Odin craves knowledge so badly, we can continue through to the other details of his hanging: the spear, the 9 knights, and the tree from which he hangs. We saw all of this in the stanzas I read at the beginning of the video. To be wounded by a spear is to be marked for Odin. We have at least 2 mythological instances where this is made explicit. First, in the Ynglinga saga. Here, Odin is the king of all Swedes. But eventually he falls sick and succumbs to his illness. Right before passing away, however, he marks himself with a spear. Explicitly, he gives himself a physical wound, offering himself to himself just as he did with his hanging. In the very same passage and chapter, the god Njordr takes on the role that Odin left behind. He is now also the king of the Swedes. He also falls sick, and on his deathbed he also wounds himself with a spear. He is thus dedicated to Odin in the last moments of his life. The text makes sure to highlight both of these instances. The second explicit occurrence of this marking practice is found in the Gautreks saga. Through a certain sequence of events, it becomes known that King Vikar must be sacrificed to Odin in order to ensure safe passage for his troops at sea. His men decide to stage a mock execution, since nobody wants to kill their king in the middle of a war. They make a noose out of the intestines of a lamb. They tie the king up on a small bush, and one of his men takes a small reed to stab him with. All of this would have been harmless. The intestines are too weak to suffocate him, the bush is too short for any proper elevation, and the reed is nothing more than a stalk of grass. The king and his men thought that they could trick Odin. They are technically hanging the king, just as Odin likes it, but it wouldn't be fatal. As the man with the reed stabs at King Vikar, imitating the spear, he declares, "I give you to Odin." As soon as these words leave his mouth, the intestines turn into a strong rope. The bush sprouts into a large tree, and the reed transforms into an actual spear. Thus, King Vikar dies, hanged, unable to trick Odin and wounded by the spear. He is given to Odin. On top of these explicit instances of spear marking, we also know that the spear of Odin consecrates the living and the dead. In the Voluspa, as the very first act of the Aesir-Vanir War, Odin hurls his spear over the heads of the Vanir and screams, "Odin owns all of you." From this point onwards, every being that falls in this battle becomes bound to Odin, for the purposes of later serving in the army of Ragnarök. Likewise, this practice was carried over to the human realm. To throw a spear over the heads of the charging enemy was to dedicate them to Odin. Each and every warrior is marked in this way, and when they fall in battle, the Valkyries fly over the bloodied fields and collect that which rightfully belongs to the Allfather. Why the spear specifically marks offerings for Odin is impossible to ascertain. The answer here could be very simple. The spear was a very common weapon. It was also a good and powerful weapon. Here we must remain content with the knowledge that to be given to Odin is to be marked by a spear. Being killed by the spear also serves the same exact purpose. Odin was marked by a spear and he hung for 9 long nights. This duration is significant, and yet it is just as elusive. From a deep study of Norse mythology, we now know that the number 9 bears some mythological and esoteric significance for the Vikings. We see it appear everywhere and in every setting. In the Voluspa, a dead Volva declares that she remembers the 9 worlds and the 9 roots of the sacred tree. Unfortunately, these are never properly outlined for posterity. In the Poetic Edda, we learn of only 7 worlds, although the Grimnismal states that the sacred tree only has 3 roots, and not 9. 3 times 3 is 9, of course, but we can set the numerology aside. The world is created from 7 parts of the dismembered giant Ymir, and yet in the Gylfaginning, the goddess Hel rules over 9 worlds. Whether these are the 9 regions of the underworld or the 9 realms as mentioned in the Voluspa will never be known. The point here is that even though we see other numbers here and there, the number 9 consistently recurs. What we just described is only one of the many instances where the number 9 appears in the mythological setting. If we are to take an approach centered around the importance of fertility in pagan cultures, then the number 9 may be nothing more than a symbol for human pregnancy. The duration of Odin's hanging can be explained in this way as well. During Odin's self-imposed torture, he is transformed and ultimately reborn, as the powerful Odin we now know, Odin the wizard and Odin the poet. He now gains access to the runes and their associated spells. He also proves to himself and to everybody else that he can withstand the most agonizing pain. Suffocation is no gentle ordeal. Evidently, what did not kill him made him stronger. Odin is born again. And as we will see later, it is quite possible that he did indeed undergo an actual birth or resurrection back into the realm he usually inhabits after these 9 long nights on the windy tree. It is also worth noting, and I will repeat this again at the culmination of our interpretation, that the god Thor took 9 steps before he died in his battle at Ragnarök. He is mortally wounded before the first step, but there is a liminal period between full life and full death, represented by 9 steps. The same 9 steps that a child takes in the womb in the form of 9 months. This child is neither fully formed, neither fully dead. I would go as far as to say that a lot of mythology can most easily be interpreted as stories about fertility. This is an approach that many interpreters take, even though it can end up being a bit lazy to diminish everything to fertility exclusively. Before we move on to the next layer of our interpretation, we must speak of the windy tree that Odin hangs from. Without a doubt, this tree is Yggdrasil, the world tree. The world tree is immense, and it is sacred. It stands at the center of the cosmological order. Its roots and branches reach to the various realms. The aforementioned well of Mimir, where Odin took out his own eye, is situated beneath one of these roots. Likewise, the underworld is also located beneath one of the roots. Yggdrasil is inhabited by all manner of creatures, and the gods visit it daily to hold their assemblies. It is an immense tree, and it suffers things which no man will ever understand. It groans and shivers, especially during Ragnarök. It is believed that the two humans who survive Ragnarök hide inside Yggdrasil, from where they repopulate the world once more. It goes without saying that the sacred world tree survived the apocalypse, both the cruel winter that preceded it and the burning of the entire world throughout it. This notion of a holy immense tree is very ancient. It can be found in almost every pagan tradition in some form. It is not always at the center of the world, but the tree nevertheless remains a very important figure within the spiritual order of the pre-Christian world. As I mentioned in my shorter video on Odin and mythological symbolism, the tree acts as the cosmological axis, the axis mundi. Strictly speaking, due to its verticality, the tree connects the two poles of the planet, the north and the south, or the land and the sky. It encompasses the entire world from top to bottom. It runs through it. It is at the same time the navel of the world and its cradle, the center of balance from which all else radiates. Among the Siberian shamans, the tree acts as a ladder. After the successful induction of a trance, the shaman physically climbs up the tree in order to pass between realms. He ascends from the busy material realm up to the top of the tree, upon which an eagle will often sit. Here there is a great expanse, the great blue sky. In other words, clarity. It is from here that the gods can be communicated with properly, for they reside in the heavens, in higher realms. And from the top of the tree, the distance between the shaman and his gods is the shortest. Among the Germanic peoples as a whole, the tree was very important. Individual trees were often dedicated to deities. For example, the oak. It is a thick and robust tree, and it was most often venerated as a symbol of a thick and robust god. In the case of the Vikings, this would be Thor. For the Slavs, this was Perun, Zeus for the Greeks, and so on. Of course, all of these deities are thunder deities. They strike the earth with lightning, and thus at times they also strike the trees. A tree that is struck in this way is therefore marked by the deity and is to be venerated as containing some store of his power. In this specific region of the world, it is the oak that gets struck very often, since it is a very large tree that dominates the space of the sky. It cannot be a surprise then that in a culture dominated by forests and trees, the tree plays a part in forming the center of the universe. It is also very worth noting that the first humans were created from tree trunks. They carry the names Ash and Vine. Odin and his two brothers fashioned the human race in this way. Ash, as in ash tree, is the male, and Vine is the female. The female Vine wraps herself around the male Ash, and thus the two grow together, bearing great fruit, the human race. Here we can also highlight the inherent cyclicality of life encapsulated within Viking myth. The first humans were made from tree trunks by Odin, and the last humans who are to repopulate the world after Ragnarök find shelter within the trunk of the world tree. The tree is always at the center of life, the center from which life springs, and to which life returns in searches of stability and grounding. Odin thus sacrifices himself on the world tree, which is symbolism par excellence. He binds himself to the eternal center of the world, to the axis of the world. This escalates his act to a universal proportion. He bears his 9 nights of torment at the very center of the world. It is existence itself, within the limits defined by the world tree, that Odin affirms when he hangs from it. Had Odin given himself to himself via the medium of any regular tree, his act would not have such massive proportion. This would be a god hanging in some place of no importance, consecrating it for the future, for the acolytes of his cult to worship later. Instead, Odin sacrifices himself on the central and most important pillar of the world. In other words, Odin sacrifices himself on the world itself. It is the fabric of the entire world that is symbolized through the world tree, and it is throughout this fabric that the screaming and agony of the hanging Odin reverberates. Therefore, Odin permanently associates suffering for a higher cause to the axis of the whole world. Due to Odin's hanging, the foundation of the world is now thoroughly seeped in the possibility, reality, and importance of self-imposed suffering. Since Odin undertakes this suffering as a necessary step in the lead-up to Ragnarök, he thereby also affirms fate. It is now present all throughout the foundations of the world. It was fated that Odin is to die at Ragnarök. It was fated that he would seek knowledge to learn more about this fateful death, and therefore it was fated that Odin was to hang from the world tree, binding himself to the very foundation of reality in a very gruesome way. It is also worth noting that we have no explicit information about the creation of the world tree. A starting point for Yggdrasil is never mentioned. It may have been made out of Ymir's body, when Odin and his brothers created the rest of the world. But we could just as easily say that the world tree is ageless, that it is eternal. We do not know. It feels strange to presume that there was a time without the world tree, that the realms fashioned from Ymir's dismembered body would not be interconnected via the world tree. And yet, across many mythologies, the world and its pillars proceed from a cold void. The axis is not eternal. Nevertheless, even if the world tree is one of the first creations in the world, it still survives the end of the world, when everything else burns to ash. For the purposes of mankind, this tree is as close to ageless as it can be. Odin's sacrifice on this almost ageless tree is therefore also an affirmation of time itself. By sacrificing himself on that which might be timeless, he breaks the barrier and the distance between time and eternity. Here we have an act that lasts a very specific period, 9 long nights, and it is committed upon a pillar that appears to be outside of time. We could go as far as to say that Odin hanging himself upon the timeless world tree is the creation, definition, and affirmation of time. He delineates a time period in the vast expanse of mythological time, and he gives this time period a great importance, for he is a god that chose to do this to himself for 9 long nights. Thus, Odin affirms time as an important fabric of reality. Again, he is meticulous and specific with how much time he spends hanging on this tree, and since this portion of the Hávamál is spoken by Odin himself, we know that he wanted to tell us this precise fact. Odin could have just as easily kept silent on how long he was hanging for, and from where he hung, but it was important to him to share this information in the form of poetry. Odin, of course, speaks in divine rhyme. He is a poet and a god of the poets. We must always treat the poet as the ultimate mouthpiece of both mankind and of the divine. The poet is inspired by the muses. He is a mad and possessed medium for words and sentiments that come from somewhere else. There is a reason why countless poets have referred to poetic inspiration as something external, that the words came to them, and all they did was provide their body and talents as a medium to channel these words and sentiments. Through the poem of the Hávamál, Odin also channels the importance of this act. By binding himself to the foundation of the entire world, it is then possible that Odin intuited knowledge that he hadn't been able to acquire before. In this specific case, he acquires the runes. As we said earlier, Odin breaks the traditional mold of sacrifice because he is at once the sacrificer, the offering, and the recipient. Due to not having some external, separate recipient, we are therefore forced to conclude that the runes Odin received were already disposable to him. Perhaps he had knowledge of the runes that he could not access for some reason. This is an idea that we will return to toward the end of our video. Therefore, Odin unlocks within himself the runes by undergoing a great trial. Since he hangs on Yggdrasil, the axis and foundational fabric of the world, he binds himself to this very fabric. What I've been trying to say here is that Odin integrates himself into the fabric of the world for 9 days. He becomes one with the tree, and thus he becomes one with the axis that grounds all of existence. He infiltrates the center of the world and becomes part of it. Essentially, he is inside the universe. Breaking this barrier evidently requires a horrendous torment, for to understand the universe is to understand the crucial role of suffering in it. Suffering defines the limits of life after all. At the highest moment of suffering, when you are being crushed or suffocated, you are also at the very limits of life. Odin faces these limits through his intense suffering, and he unlocks the knowledge of runes in return. We can therefore make the conclusion that the power of the runes is very high. Their significance is directly represented by just how much suffering Odin had to undergo in order to unlock them. He had to approach the limits of life and sit there, or hang there. Since there is no external recipient that gives him the runes in return, we can therefore also say that the runes are inherent to life. They are located somewhere at the very limits of life. This, of course, stresses the value and worth of poetry and the value of the word as a whole. Again, Odin submits his body and receives the runes, just like a poet who submits his body and mind to the mysterious channels through which poetic inspiration flows. The source of this inspiration is unknown. The poet has to submit himself and wait for this inspiration to simply arrive. Odin submits himself to himself on the world tree, and the runes then arrive from somewhere. Ultimately, we don't really know from where, at least not for now. We'll get back to that when we cover our final interpretation. Let us summarize here before we move on. Every detail of the Hávamál stanzas is significant. With each piece of information, we are able to build a more intricate and complex image. Of course, mythology is never that simple. There is no one answer to any question. This is why mythology remains eternally beautiful. It is rich for interpretation. At the most surface level, we see that Odin hung himself on a tree for 9 days, with a self-inflicted spear wound. By doing so, he learned the runes. But as we peel back the interpretive layers, we very quickly begin to climb the ladder of complexity. Odin is affirming the necessity and utility of suffering within the very fabric of existence, by pushing himself to the limits of physical reality. Through this affirmation, by making the biggest offering possible to the biggest recipient, himself to himself, he unlocks an extremely powerful knowledge that is beneficial for his fate. The fact that he is fated to die and that he knows of this motivates him to do nothing but increase his power. In Odin's case, an increase in personal power is almost always an increase in knowledge. Whether this knowledge comes from without or from within is of no real importance for now. The important point is that Odin is willing to commit the most painful act dedicated to the highest deity in order to gain what he seeks. In this way, Odin overcomes himself. He suspends himself for 9 days in a liminal space between life and death, and he is then born again, more powerful, more prepared for inevitable fate. There is one more interpretation of this entire sequence that we still have not covered. It is a much more concrete interpretation that relates his act of hanging to the acquisition of knowledge directly. It is with this interpretation that we will conclude the video. But before we do this, I would like to take a moment in order to talk about ritual itself, specifically the difference between sacrifice, martyrdom, and initiation. Odin hanging himself is certainly a sacrifice. The language that is used in the Hávamál stanzas leaves us without any doubts. Odin is given to Odin, in the same exact way as King Vikar is given to Odin when his mock execution transforms into a real one. But as we stated several times, Odin's self-sacrifice does not fit into the traditional mold of ritual sacrifice. Of the 4 distinct parts that make up the sacrificial formula, 3 of them are the same thing in Odin's case. This is not a king being sacrificed to Odin by his men in order to receive some kind of military blessing. Not at all. Here it is Odin giving himself to Odin, in return for knowledge of an indeterminate origin. It is for this specific reason that another suggestion has been put forward, namely by Anton Gerard van Hamel. Odin's self-hanging is not a sacrifice, but instead a martyrdom. We have to define martyrdom in order to proceed here. It is the death or the suffering of a martyr. The martyr himself is an individual that endures suffering due to his advocacy of a religious belief. The word martyr originally meant witness. The individual is called as a witness to his own religious beliefs, and he is then punished for the position he holds. He suffers either because he subscribes to certain religious views or because he advocates them even when explicitly instructed not to. From this definition, it is difficult to see how Odin would ever be considered a martyr. Nobody summoned him to witness or answer for his own views. He is not persecuted by anybody except himself. Van Hamel's terminology is certainly strange here, but the focus of his definition does not lie with the aspect of prosecuted religious belief. Instead, Van Hamel calls this an act of martyrdom in order to differentiate it from the evidently problematic formula of sacrifice. More specifically, to point out a difference in one of the stages of the formula. This is a difference that a small handful of scholars find to be better explained under the meaning of martyrdom. Let us see this in more detail. As we said earlier, in a sacrifice there is a fourfold formula. There is a sacrificer who gives something, and there is a recipient who gives something in return. The important thing to highlight here is that the recipient gives willingly. The sacrificer relies on goodwill and reciprocity. You sacrifice an animal to the rain god, and you hope that this is good enough for him, that the rain god will see your offering, find it pleasing, and then offer you something in return. In the traditional sacrifice, you are appeasing and pleasing the god through a constant, willful relationship. The sacrificer has no aims to overwhelm the god or force him into giving something. Again, the sacrificer relies on the goodwill of the recipient. Thus, his main concern is whether the value of the offering is good enough. This power dynamic is a submissive one. The offering is submitted for an evaluation to the recipient, and the only thing that the sacrificer can then do is sit back and hope. He has no real force. In the case of a martyrdom, however, the relationship is different. At least this is how Van Hamel sees it. It is a fundamentally dominating relationship. The martyr attempts to dominate the other party. Just like the sacrifice, the martyr offers something of value. In this case, it is always himself. He martyrs himself in the name of a higher cause, hoping to achieve something through this act. The target of the martyrdom is to be overpowered. This is not just mere appeasement, it is very forceful. Great suffering is involved for some kind of cause. In Odin's case, the explicit cause is the acquisition of the runes. Odin overcomes the evident difficulty of attaining the runes by martyring himself. He gives himself. As we said earlier, his great suffering brings him to the very limits of life, where life is about to end due to the great extent of suffering. Let us keep in mind that Odin was not immortal. Through this act, he attempts to dominate existence. If he dominates it adequately, he will be able to force out life's most sacred knowledge. This is a much more personal and existential ordeal. Odin essentially has to dance with death. He does this to further his aims. This is not the same thing as a simple ritual sacrifice. Perhaps martyrdom is not the most appropriate word here. A multitude of scholars have indeed pushed back against this terminology. Olof Sundqvist, most notably. And yet a forceful, deliberate acquisition of knowledge is completely in line with Odin's character. He doesn't merely hope for things to arrive to him, he always takes them by force. He is even willing to martyr himself. This is somewhat convoluted, but I hope the distinction here is at least somewhat understandable. Odin endured great suffering as an expression of immense power that guaranteed him the runes. As we said, the traditional sacrifice never has any kinds of guarantees, but the martyrdom often does. As a third possible category for this self-hanging ritual, we also have initiation. This is of course a rite of passage that marks the entrance of an individual into some group. Initiations are usually thought of as occult events, done behind closed doors and in the company of private, mysterious eyes. This doesn't always have to be the case though. Any procedure that filters an individual from the masses into some group is an initiation. The ancient Greek youth was initiated into the adult class. In Athens, this was the ephebia. The citizens check if there are any public objections to you becoming a citizen. You then take your vows around the age of 18 to uphold the divine laws of the city, and this is followed by 2 years of compulsory military service. If everything goes smoothly, you then join the group of legal adults. This was your initiation. Surprisingly, the initiation follows a similar formula to sacrifice. The initiate is the sacrificer, and he offers himself to the recipients, i.e. to the citizens, in this case. The citizens then exercise their goodwill and bestow upon you legal adulthood, i.e. citizenship. This formula works for any closed group. The only difference here is that the sacrificer and the offering are one and the same when it comes to initiations. There is no external object being offered during the initiation ceremony. Even if you do come with some kind of wealth, you are still offering yourself mainly. Your talents, your possessions, your body for war, and so on. This is the case for both exoteric initiations like citizenship in ancient Greece and also esoteric initiations, where one pledges himself to some group in return for membership. We can instantly see how Odin's self-sacrifice fits into this mold much better. As we said, Odin breaks the traditional sacrifice formula by being the sacrificer, the offering, and the recipient at the same time. If this is an initiation, however, this problem goes away. There is nothing wrong with Odin being both the sacrificer and the offering. The only issue that remains is that he is also the recipient. But it is precisely here that we must zoom out a little bit and consider the real-life significance of this act, of this story. Specifically, its significance for a real-life cult. A cult of Odin certainly existed. In fact, it existed in at least 3 distinct flavors, even though there were probably many more. One of these flavors was an Odinic cult of the Scandinavian aristocracy. Odin was a patron and legitimizer of the rulers, of the best and the better turned out. It makes sense that the highest figures of human society would worship the highest figure of the religious pantheon. After all, they are like the manifestations of Odin on earth. Another flavor of great interest is the Odinic cult of ecstatic youth warriors. This is a rather complicated topic to which I will dedicate a separate video in the future. Finally, we have the Odinic cult of the dead, thoroughly investigated by Dr. Stephen Grundy in 1995. Again, as fascinating as it is, I have to leave this for another time. These cults deserve thorough attention, and they will take us too far away from the subject of this video. There are numerous other hypothetical Odinic cults, and pre-Odinic cults as well, the cults of Wotan among the Germanic peoples. The reason I bring this up is to say that all of these cults required initiation. It is natural. In order for there to be some form of initiation, a rite of passage that is repeated each time, you need to have a mythological, symbolic counterpart. It is possible that Odin's hanging was precisely this counterpart for an initiation ritual in at least some of these cults. To participate in an initiation ritual means to receive a certain set of knowledge, or to receive a certain role. The members of the cult impart on you everything that you need to know in order to be part of the group. You take on a new role. You are now the initiated member. You certainly have a new set of responsibilities and a new function within the closed group. In some cults, you are referred to as being born again. You shed off your old skin and wear a new skin instead, a special skin that is interwoven with all sorts of necessary knowledge and new permissions. Can we not say that this is precisely what happened to Odin as well? Odin sacrifices himself to himself, and in return he receives the knowledge that is necessary for all of his future roles. He now has the runes and 18 spells, i.e., he has his new role of being a wizard. These spells open up a world of possibilities for him. He can now heal the sick, he can make weapons dull, he can break any chain that binds his body, speak to the dead, and so on. He has been initiated into his own cult. Supposedly, the Odinic acolyte is to follow the same example, although it is highly unlikely that anybody ever hanged and starved themselves for 9 days. We unfortunately have no credible evidence for this part of history. We can only theorize that this ritual was recreated in some fashion. Perhaps the initiates had to hang for 9 minutes or even 9 seconds. Perhaps they did not hang at all, and instead they underwent some other form of symbolic initiation that mimicked Odin's behavior, or even Odin's hanging. Since the knowledge that was gained by Odin was evidently extremely powerful, it is very likely that any cult practicing this specific initiation and tradition would have been kept very secret. Very few people are made for the possession of magical power, especially when male practice of magic was rather unbecoming for a predominantly masculine culture. Regardless, the mold of initiation seems to be an almost perfect fit for Odin's hanging, even if we cannot reliably know how this symbolic initiation was translated into the real-life cult. All of this is to say that Odin's self-hanging cannot be neatly put away into any one box. Mythology generally is very multifaceted, and Odin is simply that much more. Regardless whether his act was a sacrifice or a martyrdom or an initiation, we have the same facts before us. Odin willingly underwent a great period of agony in order to gain knowledge. This self-hanging was of a cosmic proportion, since it occurred on the sacred world tree, the center of the world. Odin bound himself to the axis of the world and thus its very core, where he endured great suffering in the name of a higher cause. This entire act is now forever imprinted into every layer of existence. His suffering is pervasive. He screams as he looks down and receives his reward. He then falls down from the tree and steps into his new role, born again, with improved ability and a new set of functions for the coming of Ragnarök. There is one more interpretation of Odin's self-hanging that we must outline. It is much more direct and much less symbolic than what we have said up until this point. It also allows us to integrate a very interesting psychological motivation for his self-sacrifice, namely by positing that his search for knowledge is existential and unavoidable, and it is conditioned by his very own biology. It goes as follows. Odin hung himself on Yggdrasil in order to simulate his own death. In this half-dead or maybe even fully dead state, he was able to travel to the underworld. There he extracted the most secret and valuable knowledge, the knowledge of the dead. It is well attested in a great multitude of cultures that the dead possess inordinate amounts of knowledge. Our beloved ancient Greeks, of course, held the belief that one is able to talk to the dead via the process of dreaming. Likewise, during a trance, the Siberian shaman is able to travel between all of the realms, including the realm of the dead. In this realm, the shaman communicates with those who have passed away and extracts their wisdoms. This is only one small part of the wider, ancient cult of ancestor worship. But why is it that the dead possess some profound, secret knowledge? What separates them from us, the dead from the living? Why is their knowledge different to ours? Firstly, this is because the dead exist outside of time. They are no longer bound to the physical world of the living, and thus they are no longer bound to the physical passage of time. Whether for the Greeks or for the Norsemen, the dead exist in a plane where the past, the present, and the future all melt into one. They can effectively see a much broader picture. If time is a flat circle, then it is the dead outside of this circle who can look down on it and pinpoint events, regardless of where they fall on the conventional chronology. As we will shortly see, it is the dead that inform Odin of Ragnarök in the first place. It is from the dead that Odin learns that he will also die. He will be swallowed alive by the great wolf Fenrir, and it is his son who will avenge him. On top of this, the dead are not only outside of chronological time, they are also much more familiar with the workings of fate than we are. The reason for this is very simple. They have already lived out their fates. The man who is still alive and whose life has not ended just yet is not familiar with the full extent of fate. He will not be familiar with this full extent of fate until that very moment of glorious death. You cannot claim to fully understand a book if you have not read the very final chapter. With this analogy, we can describe the dead as having read the full book, put it down, and then digested it forever. This occurs in a place where time does not pass, in the underworld. Having fully absorbed the knowledge of their own fates, and thus understanding how fate itself functions, it is no surprise that many men would seek the dead in order to answer life's most burning questions. What will happen to me? What am I here for? Supposedly, the dead have better answers for these questions than any living beings do. There is another reason why the knowledge of the dead is so valuable. It is because they are not constrained by the limits of the physical body. This is very reminiscent of Plato's Phaedo, or Montaigne's essay on philosophizing as a preparation for death. If one is seeking the truth, it is very easy to see how the body gets in the way of this. Something as basic as hunger can get in the way of a good sequence of thought. There are entire lifestyles that do nothing but distract you from the search for knowledge and truth. Perhaps you have fallen prey to the desires of the body and live a life of ferocious fornication. Your profound lust leaves you no space to philosophize and seek knowledge. Your mind is warped by the desires of your body. Moreover, your senses consistently trick you. You observe things in ways that they are not, or you assume that certain things don't exist because you cannot see them or feel them, and so on. The philosopher and seeker of knowledge thus understands that his body is nothing more than an obstacle. To overcome and reject this obstacle is the philosophical path. As per Socrates, to philosophize is to prepare for death and effectively simulate it before it actually comes. Once you are free from the shackles of the frail and confused body, you can then approach divine knowledge uninhibited and without physical restraint. Since the dead have no body, since they are shadowy spirits that have no need of warmth, food, or drink, they can obtain knowledge without any obstacles or physical restraints. Since they can do this outside of physical time, their acquisition of knowledge takes on an exponential rate. They spend an eternity understanding fate and everything to do with the afterlife, and they can then provide this knowledge for the one who demands it. Having now stressed the value and quality of the knowledge that the dead possess, we can look at Odin specifically. As we mentioned earlier, it is specifically from the dead that Odin obtains the most crucial pieces of information. We have two separate accounts of this here, both from the Poetic Edda, the Voluspa and Baldr's Draumar. In the Voluspa, we see Odin speaking to a Volva, i.e. a female seer or prophet who knows many things. It is never explicitly stated that she is dead, but scholarly analysis of the entire text predominantly agrees that she is in fact dead, that Odin has resurrected her in order to speak with her. The immense amount of knowledge she possesses about the world cannot possibly be possessed by a living being. There is simply no way to have such a breadth of information. This Volva tells Odin many things. She begins with a detailing of how the world was created. She states that she remembers how things were before Ymir's body was hacked into pieces. She remembers the giants that were around in the most ancient times and how they helped raise her and taught her the powers she now has. She then recalls how humans were created by Odin and his brothers, as well as the war between the Aesir and the Vanir. After recalling all of this, she stops and tells Odin that she knows all of his secrets as well. She knows that he carved out his eye to put it into Mimir's well, that his eye still floats in that well, and that Odin gained great knowledge by doing this. Here we have a very important refrain that then comes. The Volva asks if Odin has understood everything she has said, and if it is necessary for her to continue speaking. The tone here is somewhat hesitant. There seems to be an implication of danger. What she says next is not for the weak to hear. Not everybody can possess this knowledge. Of course, Odin compels her to continue sharing what she knows. It is at this point that the Volva reveals to Odin his apocalyptic fate. There will be a long winter, and then an apocalyptic battle, where all of the gods will fight and many of them will die. The first event of this entire sequence will be the death of Odin's son Baldr. Then the rest of the gods will follow. Freyr will be slain by the giant Surtr. Thor will die fighting the world serpent Jormungandr. The war god Tyr will be consumed by the monstrous dog Garmr. And Odin, of course, will be eaten by Fenrir. The Volva tells Odin that all of this destruction will be followed by a rebirth of the world. The sacred world tree will tremble, but it will not fall. Inside its center, 2 human beings will survive and repopulate the world once more. At the very end of this account, she gives one more ominous detail. The dragon that had spent all of this time gnawing at one of Yggdrasil's roots, Nidhogg, will fly into the world, carrying countless corpses on his wings. At this point, the Volva exits from her trance and lies down. This is widely interpreted as the resurrection spell being broken and her being put back in her grave. Thus, Odin has consulted the dead and learned in extensive detail of the fate that awaits him. This is by far the most extensive and detailed elaboration that he ever receives on what the future holds for him and the rest of the gods. This most extensive and detailed elaboration was given to him by the dead. Similarly, in Baldr's Draumar, Odin once again speaks to a dead Volva. In this case, we know with certainty that she is dead. Odin approaches a grave and resurrects the Volva buried inside. The reason he does this at all is due to the dreams of his son Baldr. Baldr was having nightmares, and the gods gathered together to discuss this matter. Here, Odin decided to disguise himself and travel to the underworld. He is thus presented as the Wanderer. This is the same Wanderer that we see in Richard Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung. Odin finds a dead Volva and forces her to interpret the nightmares that Baldr has been having. This Volva does not recognize Odin, and she is extremely hesitant to speak. Odin has to drag this information out of her 3 times. Each time she says that she won't speak anymore, but Odin manages to overpower her. Through this conversation, Odin learns that his son Baldr is fated to die, that he will be killed, and then he will be avenged. The death of Baldr is the first event of the coming Ragnarök. The Volva eventually sees through Odin's disguise, and she tells him to write home proudly, for he managed to get her to speak, and she will speak to nobody else until Loki escapes from prison. It is worth pointing out that at this point Loki was not in prison, and it is Loki who causes the sequence of events that gets Baldr killed. Only after that is Loki imprisoned. Therefore, the Volva essentially says that she will not be speaking to anybody again until Baldr is dead and Ragnarök is underway. Of course, it will be far too late by that point. Odin has no choice but to accept this fate and write back to the rest of the gods. It is this second story about Baldr's dream that allows us to properly interpret Odin's self-hanging. To do this, we must point out one important detail. When Odin visits the Volva in the underworld, he is not actually inside the underworld. He seems to be at the very threshold of it, at the edge of hell. There is no mention of him ever entering the Hall of the Dead. This is an important detail that would have been mentioned by the poets if there was knowledge that he did indeed go inside it. When Odin rides down to the underworld, he finds the grave of the Volva on the edge of hell, at the threshold, and he resurrects her there. In all of Nordic mythology, in fact, there is never any mention of Odin actually entering the underworld. It very much appears that he is not able to do this. Of course, Odin is a powerful god, but he is not all-powerful. The underworld has very strict boundaries, and it seems to be the case that the living, or Odin at least, are not able to properly penetrate those boundaries. In order to approach even the edge of the underworld, Odin has to wear a disguise. Again, he is the Wanderer. The Volva is hesitant to speak to him precisely because he is a wanderer. He is not meant to be here. He is evidently alive and is wandering in forbidden territory. There is a reason why speaking to the dead is seen as such an impressive and valuable magical feat. Living men are not meant to enter the realm of the dead, even if these men are gods. The underworld is strictly for the dead. With this in mind, Odin's hanging immediately gains a new level of clarity. Odin knows that the dead possess immense knowledge. Everyone knows this, in fact, for the reasons we outlined earlier. The most important pieces of information Odin ever received about his fate came from 2 dead Volvur. But since Odin is alive, he cannot enter the underworld to extract further knowledge. When he travels to the edge of the underworld in Baldr's Draumar, he has to wear a disguise, and the Volva sees through it rather quickly. She then refuses to speak to him or anybody else about future events until they actually occur. And yet, Odin needs this knowledge. He needs to prepare himself adequately for his death. Perhaps there is a way to prevent his death of which he is yet to learn. Maybe, just maybe, fate can be changed. Or there is more than one possible fate depending on the actions he takes. How is Odin to gain this knowledge if the dead Volvur see through his disguise? How is he to speak to the dead properly if he cannot penetrate the strict boundaries of the underworld? It seems that there is only one viable answer here. Odin has to die. This is precisely what occurs when Odin hangs himself. He agonizes upon a windy tree for 9 long nights. He then looks down and learns the runes. The runes give him an immense amount of new power. He now knows 18 spells, and he has now made his body stronger through this self-imposed suffering. It is very possible that Odin died on the tree, and thereby he gained access to the underworld. Notice that Odin was not given any food nor drink for 9 days. It is also the dead who do not have any need of such things. Odin gaining access to the underworld is him looking down. He looks within the underworld, and from there extracts the very valuable knowledge of magical runes. It is also possible that he was able to resurrect himself from the underworld with this newfound magical knowledge. Hence, Odin screams, like a child that comes out of the womb, and he then falls off the tree upon which he hung. We cannot confirm nor deny whether Odin actually died, or whether he entered an in-between state. As we said earlier, the duration of his hanging is important. We can compare it to the 9 steps that Thor took before he died. Thor was mortally wounded by the world serpent, but he was not dead just yet. He took 9 steps in the liminal state between life and death. The parallel here is very evident. Odin spent 9 long nights in the liminal state between the living realm and the underworld. Unlike Thor, however, he was able to continue living after his mortal wound. Let us not forget that Odin was marked by a spear. Furthermore, if we consult the poetic language of the Vikings, we see that there is a great amount of connections between the horse, the world tree, hanging, and riding. One is said to ride the gallows, like riding a horse, and there appears to be some etymological connection between the title Yggdrasil and the phrase Odin's horse. I will not go into the details of the linguistics and poetic kennings here, but you can consult Eiríkur Magnusson, Anatoly Lieberman, and Hilda Ellis Davidson for more information on this topic. Almost every paper on the Hávamál contains at least some reference to the poetic connections between horses, the world tree, and hanging. Leaning on this connection, we can then say the following. The hanged man rides the gallows. He rides the horse. Again, this is language that the Viking poets themselves used very frequently. It is therefore possible that when Odin hangs on Yggdrasil, he in fact rides the world tree, and he rides it down, all the way to its roots. One of these roots leads directly to the underworld. In order to ride this tree and reach the underworld directly, he has to hang himself on it. He has to ride this specific gallows, since it leads to the place where the most secret knowledge is contained. Whether Odin is truly dead or he assumes some kind of half-dead spirit form that allows his soul to travel is of no real importance. What matters the most here is that Odin hangs himself on the very axis that connects his realm to the realm he wishes to visit, i.e. the realm of the dead. He looks down from the world tree as he hangs, i.e. he enters the underworld, and he then rides back up the world tree in possession of new secrets. His soul enters his hanging and starving body. He screams as he wakes up because he feels all of the pain that he has just underwent. Likewise, children scream when they enter the world from the liminal space of the womb. In both cases, they are born, but Odin is born again. He is now in possession of knowledge that allows him to fulfill his role even better as a god that prepares for the most apocalyptic battle. Odin thus sacrifices himself in order to simulate death. He martyrs himself in the name of this cause, of entering the forbidden underworld, and he initiates himself into his new role by undergoing this simulated death. All of these interpretations can exist at the very same time. At the end of it all, Odin has faced death willingly, and he gained immense power by doing so. This was a sacrifice, a martyrdom, and an initiation. What we just outlined is perhaps the most sane and straightforward interpretation of Odin's hanging. It relies on nothing more than engaging with the Norse mythological corpus. It builds on itself and validates itself. The wider text of the myths and modern study of Viking poetic forms allows this interpretation to be quite reasonable. But even though we have covered the most straightforward interpretation, I would like us to investigate one more aspect of Odin before we conclude this video. Specifically, the psychological and perhaps even biological reasons that would push Odin to endure such a painful ordeal. Within the Norse myths about Odin, there is a great recurring focus on memory. At times, it seems that Odin is trying to remember something. His great acts remind us of somebody who has forgotten an extremely important piece of information, and he will do anything to gather all of the puzzle pieces back together. Let us remember that one of Odin's ravens is called Memory. He flies every day across the world and informs Odin of what he has learned. The same can be noticed with Mimir and Mimir's Well. Etymologically, the name of the giant Mimir seems to point toward memory too. Odin is so desperate to drink from Mimir's well that he plucks out his own eye as an offering. He puts it in Mimir's well, the well of memory. Mimir himself drinks from this well and thus possesses great knowledge, great memory. He is a giant after all. He is related to the primordial beings of the universe. He has knowledge of a world before Odin, or at least he has the right to possess this knowledge, since he is of giant descent. Later, when Mimir is decapitated, Odin preserves his head and carries it around with him. The head tells him many great secrets. Odin thus carries with him a source of memories. Mimir, however, is not the only giant here. Odin is also a giant. He is a half-giant. from his maternal side. Odin's father is from the line of Aesir gods, and so Odin contains in him two perfect halves, giant descent and Aesir descent. This perfectly mixed genealogy contains yet another key to explain Odin's behavior. It is well attested that the giants possess their own kind of secrets. Their knowledge is perhaps not as valuable as that of the dead, but nevertheless, there is a reason why Odin makes great efforts to extract their knowledge as well. I remind you, Odin sacrificed his eye for Mimir's well of wisdom, and he also takes the time to preserve Mimir's decapitated head. All of this is done for knowledge, most probably of a giant origin. Odin makes great efforts in relation to Mimir, and Mimir is of course linked to memory. Seeing that Odin is a half-giant, and that he extracts knowledge from giants as well, we can propose a theory. Odin is seeking the knowledge that he is supposed to have. For some reason, he appears to have forgotten it. This is primordial knowledge that the giants have access to, for they are fully primordial beings. Due to his genealogy, Odin is also supposed to have access to this knowledge. This knowledge is his birthright, but for some reason, he just cannot remember it. He cannot tap into his ancestral roots and remember what his maternal ancestors knew, the secrets they kept passing down through the generations. We can perhaps say that Odin, on a biological level, is confused. His brain is muddied by his paternal, non-giant ancestry. It is possible that non-giants and non-primordial beings are not supposed to have primordial knowledge, and yet Odin is half-primordial through descent. He has a half-claim. This half-claim burns a hole in his mind and makes him crave this knowledge immensely. This is a quest of figuring out your identity, of finding yourself. It is for this reason that Odin works so hard and puts himself through so much torment to constantly acquire knowledge. He is simply looking for something that he is supposed to have and yet doesn't have for some reason. It may very well be that this is why Odin is linked to the theme of memory throughout the entire mythological corpus. Odin is desperate to remember. This naturally begs the following question. Why does Odin need to remember? If Odin really is missing the knowledge he was supposed to inherit from his giant ancestors, why can't he just let this be? Why can't he let go? Why does he seek so desperately to patch this hole in his memory? I believe that the answer to this question elevates Odin to the most central position within the entire Viking mythology. As we said earlier, to understand Odin is to understand Norse myth, and vice versa. As we established earlier, Odin prepares for Ragnarök. He knows his fate. He knows that he is going to die. He has gathered as much knowledge as possible about this looming event. But what is this event, really? What is Ragnarök at its core? Simply put, this is primordial forces attempting to shift the balance back in their favor. They do this by destroying the order of the gods, of the Aesir and Vanir. At the very beginning of the world, a primordial giant was slain and dismembered in order to create it. But this sort of creation can never go unpunished. Primordial forces are primordial. They exist from the beginning of time, from before time. These forces are basic and fundamental to reality. They are personified by the giants and the massive beasts of Ragnarök. For countless aeons they had dominated the hierarchy of reality. But then at some point the first gods came and decimated this hierarchy. They rearranged it and they placed themselves at the head. The primordial forces thus became subordinate to the gods. Odin and his brothers dismembered Ymir and made out of him a new foundation for their own personal order, their new kingdom. We see the exact same motif with the castration of the primordial Uranus by his son Kronos. His mutilated testicles fall on the western coast of Cyprus, and from them Aphrodite is born on the island. Kronos cultivates his own cosmological kingdom until he too gets overthrown by Zeus. The same occurs with the Mesopotamian gods, the Egyptian gods, the Japanese gods. In every ancient mythology there is some variation of this story. The gods overcome primordial forces in a battle for hierarchical domination and order. However, there is another motif that also appears again and again in ancient mythologies, that of cyclicality. There is an ebb and flow between creation and destruction. The gods that overthrow primordial forces are never safe. Their status is never guaranteed. The newly established order of the gods eventually begins to crack, and through these cracks the primordial forces begin to seep through. They slowly increase in strength. This is a completely natural reflection of the world around us. We see that absolutely everything is cyclical. The sun rises and it sets. Tree leaves bloom and then they wilt. The rivers also flow and then they freeze. Our seasons cycle endlessly and our moods do as well. Everything is in a perpetual cycle. Of course, creation and destruction are also in a mutually assured cycle. They necessitate each other. Something must be destroyed in order to create something new out of the remains, and this new construction will eventually decay and be destroyed again. The very same principle applies to the cosmological order. At one point, the primordial forces reigned supreme. Then the gods overthrew them and created a highly refined order. This order will eventually fall prey to these primordial forces once again, because these forces are foundational. You can never get rid of them. This is precisely what Ragnarök is. The primordial forces reach yet another apex of their power, after a very long time of being subordinate to the gods. When the right time comes, these primordial forces then wage total war against the gods. It is precisely for this apex of primordial power and total war that Odin prepares his army in Valhalla. But how does any of this relate to Odin's hunger for knowledge? As we just established, Odin is half giant and half Aesir. He is also at the very top of the pantheon. He is an immensely powerful being and he is the creator of the world. But it is Odin's genealogy that places him at the most crucial junction within the entire existential conflict. He has equal ancestry from both of the warring sides of Ragnarök. Odin is half god and half primordial force. He is thus uniquely situated to understand the looming conflict from both sides. But unfortunately, Odin cannot remember his primordial knowledge. The fact that his fate is already sealed does not negate a change of this fate. Maybe, just maybe, if Odin had access to his primordial knowledge, i.e. the knowledge of his giant ancestors, he could somehow influence the final battle to go differently. If Odin successfully unlocks the memories of his giant ancestry, i.e. if he taps into his biology properly, he will be in a very unique position within the very middle of the conflict, perhaps even above the conflict. Recovering his primordial knowledge could show him something that he has been unable to comprehend before, and with this new comprehension, the entirety of Ragnarök would take on a different appearance. In one possible scenario, he could change the sequence of events, since he now thoroughly understands both sides of the conflict. Maybe Odin can mediate between the two sides and come to some new agreement where the primordial forces and the gods live in harmony. Of course, in this kind of order, Odin would be at the very top. Half god and half primordial. If only Odin could remember. If only he could understand every single cosmological force. It is this desperation to find the ultimate solution that pushes Odin to undergo the most severe torments. To hang on a windy tree for 9 long nights, screaming in agony. Of course, this is not the only possible scenario. It is also possible that Odin did eventually recover this knowledge and he came to understand that his death was still unavoidable. Thus, at the very apex of his power, he is consumed by the wolf Fenrir, knowing that this is the only way to guarantee the continued existence of at least one part of his cosmological order. This is the 2 humans in the world tree, as well as a small handful of surviving gods. The world is then repopulated once more, and perhaps in a distant future, another Odin arrives. As we have just demonstrated, even the shortest mythological stanzas have an immense amount of knowledge that we can derive. 2 single stanzas from the Hávamál allow us to draw a multitude of interpretations. Some interpretations are larger and some are smaller, but they all work at the same time. Again, this is the beauty of myth. It is flexible material which can be shaped into a variety of structures. These structures can of course all coexist at the same time. To one person, it might make the most sense that Odin would hang himself in order to ride the gallows to the underworld and gain knowledge. To another person, Odin's act might be purely symbolic, only meant to serve as the example of initiation into a real cult. Another person might settle somewhere in between and state that regardless of why Odin's hanging is a story at all, its existence bears great fruit. One learns many fine things from it. One of these things that we can learn is that even though fate cannot be avoided, one still has to carry out his duties for the causes he seeks. If Odin was to die anyway, he did not need to hang himself for knowledge. Nevertheless, he willingly withstands the agony, because there is something he wants to achieve through this agony. Odin affirms suffering is a part of life, a necessary part that leads to greater things. This is a very fine piece of wisdom to impart on mankind. Whatever the case may be, a sole fact remains. We know that Odin hung from a tree, given to Odin, himself to himself. He was marked by a spear and hung there for 9 long nights. No bread was he given, nor drink from the horn. He looked down and picked up the runes. Screaming, he picked them up. Then he fell off that tree, born again, renewed with an ever-increasing feeling of power. In the words of Nietzsche, what is good? The feeling of power increasing. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon.